So, a few months back we spoke about Burning Crusade Classic and the likelihood of if we would ever see it again. A chat coming off the time when we were still waiting to get into Cataclysm Classic, and many players were jumping off the bandwagon as we said goodbye to Wrath of the Lich King with no era realms in sight. And whilst personally for me I've been enjoying Cataclysm Classic and I'm looking forward to the War Within for retail, many players are still out there shouting into what feels like the abyss, saying they still want Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King back, to return with era servers similar to how we've seen vanilla. And to summarise previously what we spoke about, I mentioned that if we are to see Burning Crusade return, I thought it would likely be the start of 2025, when Cataclysm Classic is pretty much over as we'll be in Dragon Soul by then, and probably waiting for Mists of Pandaria Classic if that's on the way, with Season of Discovery potentially coming into its last few months where we'll certainly be venturing around endgame, and the War Within will have a solid footing in retail and been going for a fair while at that point, as it is due to be released in September 2024. For me this makes sense timing wise, as it'll probably be a low tide of content for each of the main versions of WoW that are around at that point, but specifically Cataclysm Classic. And releasing Burning Crusade era servers stands the chance not only to retain players who might become bored, but to also get back some players in the meantime. Now for me that makes logical sense and is such a sensible timeline and decision, it almost certainly won't be happening. But more interestingly, why is it that so many players want specifically Burning Crusade back still? Well, let's take a look. So I think the first overall point to Burning Crusade is that the expansion itself became what you'd probably call nostalgia justified, once we went through it again in Classic WoW. And by that it means through re-experiencing the expansion so many years later after its original release. It wasn't just a longing for the past that held everyone's loving memories of the game. Classic Burning Crusade simply confirmed all those long-term beliefs about how great the game itself actually was, i.e. the nostalgia for Burning Crusade wasn't solely coming from the good times and the people you played with, although that obviously is a big part of it. The nostalgia was justified by the fact the overall experience of the expansion and its content was actually just very good, outside of the people I played with, nor the fact that I'm trying to regain some sense of long lost captured youth. And with Classic WoW now starting to get further away from what many people believe to be traditional Classic WoW post Wrath of the Lich King, they believe they should have full-time access to Burning Crusade in the same way we do vanilla. In WoW we speak a lot about how the vibe of content can greatly affect your experience of the expansion in contrast with gameplay. For example, at the start of Dragonflight, many people stated the vibe was simply off due to the rather friendly themed content and aspects we were seeing. This was then solved by going through the next two raids, Aberrus and Emirdrasil, by fighting giant monsters that were made of fire, which put things right back onto track for Dragonflight. And with Burning Crusade both in the expansion's name and the very first few moments you experience in the expansion, the vibe is hit right on the money, as you finally step through the huge dark portal to unveil a new world, only to be greeted by the Burning Legion's pit commander, leading an assault on the portal with, you guessed it, giant monsters made of fire. Based in Hellfire Peninsula, a barren wasteland filled with evil orcs, wild creatures, demons, and the iconic Fell Reavers. And yeah, there's lots of fire as well. And this feeling of exploration and experience was key to vanilla WoW, where you did feel like a small adventurer heading into a very dangerous and unknown land, realizing that not only the world but the universe that WoW was set in now is far bigger than you. We had a new world that felt open, diverse, with lots of detail, yet still didn't feel entirely overwhelming or over bloated, which is a theme that people regularly complain about now in WoW. It carried through the existing themes of vanilla that we loved and simply painted them in a different cover, bringing to life some of those scenes we got in the original Warcraft games, which at the point of BC's release wasn't all that long ago. To put it simply, Burning Crusade feels like pretty solid Warcraft, and this vibe ran throughout the content we were able to then experience in this new world also. So visually, the expansion looked great as noted, which worked well with a pretty good story drawn as a continuation from original Warcraft, with iconic characters such as Illidan and Kil'jaeden to make a fairly engaging and consistent leveling and endgame experience. As a result, we had some of the best zones in WoW's history to level in. Personally for me, expansion wise, the best leveling experience may be only tied by Wrath, with Shadow Moon Valley being one of my favourite zones in all of WoW. And I think consistency is a big thing for Burning Crusade from level 60 to 70. It really doesn't feel like it slacks off or there are any zones I can't be bothered going through. Each area has its own unique style that still somehow ties into one another and makes a coherent leveling experience. And the dungeons we get to experience are regularly still loved by players. For example, the area in Terokar Forest where there's a whole tribunal of dungeons like Orkanai Crypts, Mana Tombs and Sethek Halls. Or Hellfire Citadel where we have Ramparts, Blood Furnace, Shattered Halls and of course, like Theridon's lair below, and that's before we even mention the goofy yet very sinister Karazhan, the epic face-off with Illidan Black Temple, or even the excellent end to the expansion in Sunwell Plateau. There's a great cadence of content to keep you engaged from 60 to 70, and well, the endgame certainly doesn't disappoint either. It's made for some of WoW's most iconic content, and when revisiting it, it still lived up to the hype. Even in retail, when I use Chromie time to level up a new character, I regularly choose Burning Crusade to spam alts, just because of how great the dungeon design is in Burning Crusade. And in this great progression of content, it only works because the gameplay of BC feels very true to Classic, where we see the progression of classes beyond vanilla to give us that extra oomph. Much similar to why many people loved the initial changes we got in Season of Discovery, it feels like vanilla WoW but with a bit of extra spice. Yet there is still enough gaps in each class to make it seem like you had to patch up those holes in raids through differentiating who was in your raid, making each class feel vulnerable and valuable at the same time in a group setting. And much like vanilla, gear feels to have weight and keep relevance for longer throughout your experience and isn't always instantly replaced. Although it isn't the same rate as vanilla, it's still present for a lot of BC and your character still takes time to build up, something that slowly began to disappear towards the end of Wrath, i.e. your time sunken into the game feels rewarded back in many ways, and your gear really is earned for the majority of the time. However, as always, we have to touch on some of the issues that Burning Crusade era realms would bring with them. Now, for some people, they don't like the fact Burning Crusade can make Azeroth feel pretty irrelevant, or those that claim the addition of flying mounts killed the game, but realistically, if you're hyped for Burning Crusade realms, I'd guess these aren't much of an issue for you. But I think it's more the long-term challenges the era realms would face that see the main issues. I mean, if we take a look at vanilla era, it really does go through heavy bouts of either high popularity or being a ghost town, but that does come with the nature of era realms being available for other low tides of content during WoW's current content. And it's pretty much era realms' jobs to fill in the gaps when there's not much else to be doing in WoW, so I wouldn't worry about this part too much. But this does bring about issues that we see in vanilla, like the absolutely horrendous economy at times with auction house prices, or what happens when people stop running lower level vanilla content and the shouts for Dungeon Finder come into play. Are these just ignored? Or would the era realms be original Burning Crusade or BC with changes and additions for the long-term health of the game, like the initial group finder system we had prior to Dungeon Finder? Or would players want 100% original BC experience? And speaking of experience, what about those who want Burning Crusade but with higher experience rates? And if the community votes for that, does that turn other players away? How do we fix faction balancing? Would it be like Season of Discovery to avoid crazy BG queue times? And if servers aren't maintained, people will say the realms will be left for dead and no one wants them. So whilst there's demand for servers, it's not quite as simple as just turning them on and letting everyone have a go. Overall, I think the shouts for Burning Crusade and Wrath era realms are still warranted and should be fulfilled likely in 2025 if there's any chance of it happening. Like all versions of WoW, Burning Crusade does have its issues, but for me and many other players, in the balance of things, the good massively outweighs the bad. But even some of those less appealing factors are what play into the charm of it, and the original trilogy of WoW. I think BC can't just be labelled as people want it back for nostalgia anymore. People got it back, played it and said, yep, it's still one of the best versions of WoW we've ever seen, and we want it back on a permanent and available basis like vanilla, and we would have a truly dedicated audience who would cement themselves in Burning Crusade consistently, in between those patches where players are off either busy in retail WoW or whatever the latest iteration of Classic is. And even if there was no maintenance on the realms, we've seen repeatedly that dedicated Classic fans do organise their own events that have come into actual existence, now hosted by Blizzard, just like Classic Hardcore, or the recent organisation of player Fresh Realms in vanilla, as Blizzard isn't hosting any new Fresh Realms. So overall, I understand why players want Burning Crusade back, and I'd love to see some era realms set up in the near future. But what do you think? Is there any reasons I left out why you like Burning Crusade? Or any reasons as to why we shouldn't see its return? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. As always though, take care out there, and I'll see you on the next one. So currently, as we charge towards the release of Cataclysm Classic, Phase 3 for Season of Discovery presses on, and we head towards the very interesting Mist of Pandaria remix for retail, it's fair to say that WoW is pretty busy right now. However, there is a demographic of players that seemingly have been forgotten about, and even amongst so much choice, are still sat there as a bit confused for what to do. Now, these are the players who have been shouting for Burning Crusade era servers for the past year or so, joined now by Wrath players, who realise the inevitable judgment day of Cataclysm is flying towards them. And it's a fairly interesting argument to make in the first place, and I get it. One of the reasons Season of Discovery is so popular is we have the familiar home setting of vanilla, but with those extra quality of life changes and spells that simply make the game overall more enjoyable. And I think to a lot of people that's why they love Burning Crusade and Wrath, that extension of vanilla WoW talent trees and gameplay into something that's just a bit more developed, and is what we see a lot of in Season of Discovery. For example, spells such as Crusader Strike and Divine Storm being added to Paladins, but with a fantastic storyline and setting alongside great raids, it's understandable why the demand for Burning Crusade Classic is now rearing its head more and more. For those who aren't interested in Season of Discovery and certainly don't want the changes that Cataclysm brings, and with so much free or dead server space in Classic Wrath, it's quite questionable why we don't have Era Realms for Wrath or Burning Crusade much like vanilla. Yet, hiding in the shadows, I think are sensible reasons for why we haven't seen the return of Burning Crusade Classic just yet. And once highlighted, I think the sad truth turns its head in many ways, but I still wouldn't say all hope is lost either. So will we ever see Burning Crusade Classic again? Let's find out. So first, let's take a look at why we haven't seen Burning Crusade nor Wrath Era Realms just yet in the same way we saw vanilla. And I think the first big point for Blizzard was that when they made the original vanilla Era Realms, they were absolutely dead. They were completely empty. No one was there. And I think that this highlighted that although the base version of WoW is a great thing to have available, it put them off making the same choice for Era Realms in Burning Crusade or Wrath of the Lich King for a little while. Yet time has moved on now, and it's been proven that vanilla Era Realms have seen a consistent return of players who just simply love being in that phase of World of Warcraft, and I'd bet heavily that Burning Crusade would certainly see a similar return if released now. So just simply turn some of those dead servers in Wrath into Wrath Era and Burning Crusade Era Realms. It's obvious, I hear you cry. However, sadly for Blizzard, it would be a pretty bad business decision at this point. Like mentioned, WoW is extremely busy at the moment with so many variations of the game, and here's where my cynical take comes into it a bit. So currently we have Season of Discovery in progress, Cataclysm Classic due to launch very soon, Dragonflight experiencing some huge changes like Plunderstorm and the Mists of Pandaria remix to lead into Season 4, and then the War Within kicking off a huge story in the World Soul Saga. So I'd hedge a big old bet that at this point in time, as Season of Discovery is popular, retail is going well, and they anxiously await to see how Cataclysm's player base shapes up, that World of Warcraft players do not need dividing into further subsets, and the player base splitting down even more. And especially with Cataclysm coming up, it's not guaranteed for success or a large player base, in the same way they could bank on Burning Crusade or Wrath Classic was going to be. It's always been a divisive expansion, even now with its Classic release still turning players away. However, there is a larger subset of players now willing to return to Cataclysm, and at this point, any distraction of the glory days, such as Burning Crusade Era Realms, would be a pretty poor business decision, and likely swing those players who are tempted by Cata away, and be drawn back to the huge carrot that is Illidan. So I think you could mainly put it down to a huge timing issue at this point. There's simply too many new Warcraft projects going on or due for release in the next few months and seeing out to the end of 2024. And I don't think on that roadmap anywhere will be Burning Crusade, sadly. However, I certainly think there is room for it in 2025. So if we put away our tinfoil hats and now put on our copium masks, we can begin to chat about when we will see Burning Crusade Classic once more. I think given we'll have seen out Season of Discovery, retained some data about Cataclysm Classic's progress, and also be in the midst of the War Within by the start of 2025, shouts Burning Crusade Classic become more realistic, as the tide will be a bit lower by this point, and a lot of anxieties will likely have been calmed by big new releases. And I think a big show of faith towards this kind of thing is actually highlighted in retail WoW. If we see the downtime between Season 3 and Season 4, we've had things like Plunderstorm and the new soon-to-be-released Mists of Pandaria remix for WoW. Some hugely experimental and very fun additions to retail that I never thought we'd see to keep us occupied. So if we come to a point next year where Mists of Pandaria Classic is on the cards, but there's a bit of a break in between Dragon Soul and Mop Classic being released, as Dragon Soul is coming in January 2025 at a pretty rapid pace, then this would be the best time to revive some servers to serve as that in-between step of content filling for Classic WoW, especially if Season of Discovery has been capped to level 60 for a while by that point, and then they're having more serious chats about a permanent Classic Plus arriving. A great way to retain the player base would be to set up some Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King era servers, or potentially a rolling realm that serves the function of going through vanilla, BC, and Wrath, as sort of an original trilogy service to players who prefer to experience the good old days. And I suppose there's the whole potential that if Cata Classic fails and Mop Classic is off the cards, then it would make only sense to fill in this space with Burning Crusade and Wrath servers. So looking at it from an overall and pretty rational perspective, and definitely not one indulged by copium, I think we'll likely be seeing Burning Crusade Classic and Wrath Classic once again, most likely in 2025 in my opinion, when the tide of content is a bit
lower and things have stabilised in retail. There's a golden spot for the return of Burning Crusade, in between when Season of Discovery and Kata are finishing, and we're crossing over either into Mists of Pandaria, Classic Plus, or whatever is next for Classic in general. I reckon the Classic WoW team is well aware of this, and is delaying the return of Burning Crusade Classic and Wrath, as they know for sure it brings back some short-term brownie points, and it's a pretty easy thing to bank on, especially if there's a bit of a player drought in Classic by the start of next year, if Season of Discovery or Kata runs out of steam. So it's not all dread and gloom, unless of course you wanted to bring Burning Crusade back this year, in which case I'm very deeply sorry. Tried to get hyped for Cataclysm? I don't know, my apologies. But let me know what you think. Will we ever see Burning Crusade Classic again? And if so, when do you think it'll hit us? Be sure to let me know in the comments below.
So we've officially come to 5 years of Classic WoW since Vanilla's launch, and 20 years of World of Warcraft celebrations are coming into sight for retail. And whilst I'm super happy with where retail WoW is at, and I'm looking forward to the 20th celebration events, for Classic it seems that the path still isn't too clear where things are headed, between Cataclysm and Season of Discovery. And in times of uncertainty, people do indeed seek comfort, reflecting there is still a demand to return to the first expansion of WoW, the Burning Crusade. And generally speaking, a fair amount of time has passed since we played through BC Classic, and a return to the expansion kind of feels due at this point, potentially for the start of 2025 when people have run through Dragon Soul and Cataclysm. But whilst I'm someone who typically thinks we should get era servers for BC and Wrath at some point in the future, there are arguments to be made against going back to these expansions that make you think, is going back such a good idea? Let's take a look. Firstly, the big and common argument against era servers for BC and Wrath is that we already have too many versions of WoW available that can confuse new, returning and existing players over which version of the game to play, and as a result splits the player base even further across different versions of the game, and then drives population down for the existing versions of WoW. And I think in theory this idea holds some weight, more so in the fact that there might be confusion for new players deciding which version of WoW to play when there's so many available choices, yet I don't buy into the idea that it splits the existing player base even further, for the simple fact that you can't split players that simply cancel their subscriptions because they can't play some form of the most popular versions of Classic WoW which should be available. I mean, the amount of people that just up and cancelled their subscriptions and quit the game when Cataclysm was announced was quite interesting, and whilst we saw a resurgence in players for Season of Discovery, it hasn't quite been enough to maintain the strong player base that the original trilogy did consistently for Classic, that being Vanilla, BC and Wrath, and it's that consistency that people yearn for. So the truth is there's a lot of people in waiting. People will play seasonal game modes, or maybe even try out retail, but the home base for a lot of players does lie in either Vanilla, BC or Wrath, and a lot of dedicated players would happily cycle through these versions of WoW. Maybe even if Blizzard set up a cyclical server that changes over a 2-year period, maybe that could work, but that's a different argument. BC and Wrath era would likely be focusing on returning or existing players, and not likely new players. And once again, you can't split a player base that just quits. For myself, I really enjoy both Classic and retail WoW, but my home base at the moment is retail and I'm really enjoying it. But it's fairly sad, as it's the first time since Classic's launch that I'm just not interested in what's happening there, whereas I probably would repeatedly return to BC and Wrath if they were on offer, in between whatever the latest release is for either Classic or retail. Now, a second big argument is that shortly after the release of era servers for Burning Crusade or Wrath, people would simply get bored as it's nostalgia baiting, and they'll become dead servers like Vanilla. Yet I feel this argument is a fairly hollow one, as Vanilla servers have been available for 5 years, and there is a repeated to return Vanilla almost in a cyclical nature, alongside player organised events such as Hardcore or the Fresh Server movement, and also a consistent demand for Classic, alongside the data that showed people do want to go back from Classic's original trilogy run. And you'd think that this would be enough to reflect that you could provide 2 to 3 dedicated servers, and they would be populated and would be appreciated. And as long as the servers are available, it's more about the people that will not only play it, but they will always likely come back to it, alongside community driven events to keep things alive and kicking. However, a big issue for setting up the servers would be what version of Burning Crusade or Wrath for say would we get, as a lot of changes were injected into them, especially Wrath, that didn't drive up much favour, and ultimately there would have to be some form of compromise from a player side to ensure the version of BC we get is a decent enough one, and it can't just be 0 changes to Burning Crusade surely, or surely not. This is the issue. What happens when the version of Burning Crusade we get isn't what certain people want, and then other people just don't turn up because it doesn't fit for them ideals and they aren't worth compromising on? Or what about when low level content starts to dry up and it's it's impossible to run dungeons, and the shouts for Dungeon Finder come into play. I'd want it, but do other people want it for lower levels? Does it remove the idea that you're playing Burning Crusade just for the sake of running content? A lot of issues would rise, yet I genuinely believe that as long as nothing deeply impacts gameplay, and we don't get a huge influx of WoW tokens into Burning Crusade, we'd be in for a good time regardless. Now, the biggest argument for why setting up era servers might not be such a good idea for the current time comes down to the issue of available resources the Classic WoW team has. It's no secret that Season of Discovery is a test run for something more long term in Classic WoW when it comes to expanding upon vanilla, and the Classic WoW team has shadily said this themselves. And tie this in alongside trying to release new content for Cataclysm or potentially heading into Mists of Pandaria, it's hard to see where they'll get any extra time to delegate towards setting up and maintaining more era servers for Burning Crusade. As whilst it's easy for us to say, hey, just use some of the dead vanilla server space for Burning Crusade and Wrath era, just turn it on. It doesn't quite work like that, and there would need to be resources delegated towards setting up and maintaining these servers in what is currently a very limited resource budget. And hey, potentially putting all their eggs into the basket of trying to build Classic Plus could see funding into the team to then set up these era servers. Or maybe, like I've mentioned in previous videos, they're just waiting for that low tide of content when Cataclysm is pretty much finished, and so is Season of Discovery, and they can gain some player favour by setting up Burning Crusade again, as it's likely a big bank of support they're sat on. But at this moment, it's likely a distraction that Classic WoW doesn't need, and I'd agree that there are other things that need to be sorted right now, like figuring out a long-term plan for Classic that isn't just re-releasing expansions. I think that definitely means we won't see Burning Crusade till next year at the earliest, but it's an understandable position that the Classic team is in. Overall, for me, I'd love to see some era realms or a cycling realm for Burning Crusade and Wrath set up at some point. They're expansions I will always return to as they feel like home to me when it comes to playing WoW in general. At the moment, I'm super happy with retail as my main base, and I'm enjoying the world within and what's to come for it, and I'll likely dip into Classic here and there, but I've not really been interested in hardcore in Cataclysm, or really bothering to get myself hyped for Season of Discovery by this point. Being honest, some era servers would be a huge draw for me to start building up confidence that something is being set up for Classic WoW, whilst we wait for the inevitable announcement of a true Classic Plus at some point. But I'll always be drawn back year after year to both Outland and Northrend. What can I say? I'm clearly a sucker for the trilogy. Yet let me know what you think. Is heading back to Burning Crusade a good idea? Or is pushing forward really the way for Classic? Let me know in the comments below. But as always, take care up there, and I'll see you on the next one. Ta-ra for now. So recently there's been a host of rumours swirling around the Classic fanbase that we are potentially in store for some fresh servers around November to mark 20 years of WoW and over 5 years of Classic. And the demand for fresh servers, whether that be in Vanilla, BC or Wrath, is a pretty cyclical demand that always seems to churn up in Classic players at least a few times a year, as players yearn for that big reset that provides a solid boost in morale and shoots some excitement back into Classic WoW, providing an original blast from the past in part of nostalgia for what it was like starting the game fresh, but also providing some pretty helpful resets to the game in a general sense that can improve gameplay aspects in Classic. So let's take a look at why players seem to want fresh servers in Classic WoW. Now, like mentioned, these are just the rumours swirling around that something potentially is on the way for Classic, which I believe came about from Soda Popping delaying a certain event for his hardcore Classic guild till November, with the source being, trust me bro, it's the best time to wait till. And it's seemingly a coincidence that this would line up for WoW's 20th anniversary, and also mark over 5 years of Classic, where we tend to get some form of celebration. And whilst retail celebrations are very clear as to what's going on, there's not been any specific lined up events for Classic as of yet. And well, this could come in the form of fresh servers for hardcore, or an extension into Burning Crusade, as well as speculation that we're getting fresh Vanilla, BC or Wrath servers, but realistically who knows at this point. Yet fresh demand always comes about for Classic players, and especially at a time when we're kind of committed to either Season of Discovery or Cataclysm, it makes sense to me. The original trilogy is typically what had the most demand when we saw Classic WoW reign supreme at the time when retail wasn't doing too great. And running through each expansion kind of did show that it wasn't just nostalgia baiting, as players did really enjoy these versions of the game and will happily return to them year after year. And such versions of the game help players set up a base where they want to live, in between experiencing what is the newest content in the game, whether that be in retail or Classic ventures, such as Season of Discovery or Cataclysm, or whilst knowing if the newest versions of the game aren't for them, they can happily return to their favoured long-term version of the game. Yet, we currently only have this for vanilla, so it makes sense there is still a demand for some new fresh servers that could sustain either Burning Crusade or Wrath of the Lich King, allowing players to re-experience these if they missed them the first or second time around, as well as continue to progress at their own pace without the fear of the servers being closed or progressed onto the next expansion. However, this ties into the Era Realms debate, and well, there's a lot of arguments already why it's not a good idea in some ways. Yet, I still favour the return of these expansions, whether that be from a baseline fresh vanilla that progresses releases onto each expansion or a respective era realm for either one. Now fresh servers also provide some pretty handy redevelopments for the current state of vanilla era, with fresh realms always coming with a host of excitement and returning on new players to repopulate these areas of the world which have just kind of been left to the dust. For example, a lot of lower level content and dungeons aren't being ran really at all, as everyone's either at 60 or going on their own little journey, or anyone who's leveling an alt is typically running through a fairly empty world. As a result, there's a host of group quests and dungeons that new players or returning players will miss out on. And whilst a patch on this could be to add something like Dungeon Finder can sit pretty awkward with some classic players. So although not a long-term fix, fresh servers do provide a temporary boost for a few months or maybe even a year, so that players can either re-experience or experience for the first time a lot of the excellent lower level group quests and dungeons that vanilla has to offer, which sadly over time have become neglected. And unfortunately it seems to be something you can't avoid unless you start adding in new systems to the game. For example, I think retail does a decent enough job of keeping older content relevant, such as using chromie time to level up new characters, or the time walking events which come every few weeks, allowing you to run old dungeons and old raids from the past expansions that actually provide up-to-date gear that can be used for current raids in the newest expansion. It's hard to see vanilla ever doing something similar to that, except for maybe adding Dungeon Finder. So for now it's understandable that a lot of players only see the way for this to become true is a game through fresh realms. Similar to the long-term issue of era realms making old content unplayable for a lot of players, is the issues that the economy starts to rear its head and you get a weird supply and demand that becomes true only with a dwindling player base. And fresh realms, once again, while not a long-term fix, will provide a new sense of sustainability or excitement when it comes to finding valuable items and trading throughout the world in a way that seems actually worthwhile, and getting to see how items progress as the whole player base progresses and pushes through new content as you head towards level 60 and obviously then go through raids is pretty interesting. For me, this is just a core part of MMORPGs in general, when it feels like there's actually some life being pumped through the world in a form of trading, where the auction house can be booming and huge parts of the game like professions actually feel worthwhile pursuing, such as mining ores for blacksmiths to craft gear that is relevant to lower level player bases. It's good fun and part of the progression of vanilla. However, sadly still not a long-term fix unless the realm is due to progress onto the next expansion. Yet sometimes it's still a breath of fresh air that's needed, and you still need to understand you're going to enjoy something that's temporary as part of your journey, and that's one of the main appeals of Classic WoW in general. Finally, I think it's still worth noting how slow Classic WoW is from vanilla to Wrath, and how long it can actually be at times when you're grinding through those first 60 levels. And for a game that's turning 20 years old, there's still a lot to which players haven't actually done or got to experience in the original trilogy, when you come around thinking about the time it takes to sink into any decent race class combination to get to 60 or 80, gearing up, running dungeons, raiding, learning professions, and then doing it all again on a new alt. And fresh servers provide this new chance for players who maybe want to experience this from a different point of view. For example, I typically run plate wearing classes on Alliance, and I think if fresh came around I'd potentially go for maining a Warlock on Horde this time, as although I sometimes run Warlock, I've never mained it, and I've never got to experience that full vanilla journey when it's new and fresh, and you're at the forefront of content, waiting for new phases to be released from a mainly Horde point of view. And the main thing is that fresh will give players this option. I mean, if it just means you stick to what you love, go for it. But for a game that's aged, it's still surprising how many new routes or experiences you can take, or see things that you haven't done before. And probably that's why the game has remained so popular for 2 decades now, is there's so many options and ways to re-experience a game you love but in a different light. And whilst the option for this is still technically available in Classic era, and the familiarity that fresh servers would do paired with a bit of hype is the kind of content that a lot of players, including myself, are craving at the moment. Until something more appealing like a Classic Plus comes along, there's still plenty of arguments against fresh realms, like the Classic WoW team's limited resources, how it might split the player base even more, or if anyone will be bothered to yada 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 blah blah blah. But I think for a change it's worth seeing why players want fresh, as well as some of the benefits that do come from it, as well as the fact that there's always going to be a demand for fresh servers in any point of the original trilogy, seen most recently with the fresh servers movement organised by players themselves in vanilla, or new ways to experience the game like hardcore that then came to be hosted by Blizzard themselves. So will we get fresh in November? Yeah, who knows what's in store, but at some point we have to get something new from the original trilogy of WoW, whether that be BC and Wrath era servers, some adjustments to hardcore, or simply just fresh vanilla for a bit of hype. Well, be sure to let me know what you think about fresh servers, and if they serve any good to Classic WoW at this current moment, and are they likely? Yet, as always, take care out there, and I'll see you on the next one. Ta-ra for now. So this month we're officially celebrating 20 years for World of Warcraft, which is absolutely mental, given the fact that WoW is still going pretty strong after all these years, alongside how many variations of the game are now available to us. And as a way of looking back with those nostalgia tinted glasses, I thought we'd take a look at the first expansion that kicked off that long line of progression and stories that are still going strong today, in reminiscing about what made WoW's first expansion, the Burning Crusade, so great and still loved by players today. So let's jump in. First, Burning Crusade served as almost a continuation or pickup of the story that we saw in Warcraft 3, seeing firsthand the absolute destruction that the Burning Legion had caused to Draenor, turning it into Outland. And partly why WoW is loved so much is feeding that deep-rooted fantasy that you can then explore firsthand for yourself. And well, Outland brought this just as much as vanilla WoW did, as you're greeted instantly by the pit commander as you travel through the Dark Portal for the first time, seeing an amazing skyline filled with stars and galaxies, combated by the rough terrain that is Hellfire Peninsula. I mean, even getting ruffled stomped by the Fell Reaver felt like a novelty. I guess some things never change. And we had this entrenched with those iconic Warcraft characters like Illidan, Kil'jaeden, as well as the introduction of the first new races of Blood Elves and the Draenei. And well, in a game named World of Warcraft, it felt incredibly fitting that our first expansion quite literally gave us a whole new world to explore. Now, in a similar way reflecting the storyline, the questing in Burning Crusade was fantastic when it came to the quest progressions themselves, as well as each zone. Somehow each zone really did have its own unique mark and design. I mean, when you think about it, how on earth did they make it feel like Hellfire Peninsula, Zangarmarsh and Nagrand could all feel connected somehow as part of one expansion? I mean, it beats me, but the progression throughout each zone really does feel somehow differentiated and new but inherently adjoined to the previous zone you were just in, and it doesn't feel like they're just randomized. And they definitely carry through a lot of the deep themes like the threat of the Legion. And in all of this we get arguably some of my favourite zones in the game like Shadowmoon Valley. I mean, in an expansion full of Fellfire commanded by the Burning Legion, it only felt right to have a huge area that was essentially on fire. And well, the questing we got was the first real change to WoW which we still see today. In vanilla, questing could take you all over the world, and whilst this was fun for exploring the new world in various ways, it was also a bit of a pain in the ass for how slow it could be at times, especially if you were on your third or fourth character by that point. Burning Crusade really streamlined your quest to remain typically in one zone at a time, and whilst this removed a bit of the exploration of the world in some ways, and there were one or two quests that did show the challenge of travelling across Outland, typically this type of streamlining quest I found overall did complement vanilla's questing once you got to Outland, and I appreciated that we had a consistent and manageable way to get from 60 to 70. Following suit, a big part of the consistency that Burning Crusade brought was its PvE content. Starting with dungeons, we had some excellent grouped dungeons that felt really embedded to the areas you leveled in, with their own little cute spaces, something that I feel we don't personally get too much in things like retail WoW anymore, as we had groups like Hellfire Citadel hosting Ramparts, Shattered Halls and Blood Furnace, with Blood Furnace offering us a little peek down into Megtherodon's lair, which to me is one of the coolest introductions to a new raid ever. I absolutely love that this is such a teaser for the later content to come and blew my mind the first time I ran it. And we had the rundown area of Orkhandoom with Orkhanai Crypts, Mana Tombs and Shadow Labyrinth, all really bringing what felt like some major spooky vibes. And we had some rather void-induced dungeons like the Mechanar and Botanica, contrasted by the very illustrious Magister's Terrace. For me, these dungeons are always the reason I'll pick Burning Crusade on Chromie time, as the layout, progression and general vibe of them is peak WoW for me. Well, raiding certainly didn't disappoint either, with huge hitters like Black Temple and Sunworld Plateau, treating us to those front-on confrontations with those massive Warcraft characters like Illidan and Kil'jaeden. And to be honest, call me a classic Andy, but Black Temple still remains probably one of my favourite raids of all time. And every time it comes on the Time Walking raid event in retail, best believe I'm smashing that thing on all of my alts. And with the PvE concept, we carried through a trait of vanilla in many ways, where whilst we did get more blue and epic gear throughout the expansion, there was still a feeling that gear had a bit more of an impact and certainly felt very valuable, especially at the introduction of Burning Crusade. And whilst not to vanilla's standard maybe, there were certain things that I did look out for. For example, as a plate-wearing class, a big step up for me always was getting the shoulder reward from a quest in Hellfire Ramparts, with those shoulders really carrying me through the majority of Outland, all mixed in with these great Warcraft themes that ran consistently and felt epic in nature, as if you were truly progressing in a way that mattered and was pretty satisfactory. And part of that progression was reflected in how classes were developed instead of being completely changed, which is something that we have seen happen more and more with each expansion release. In Classic WoW today, we talk a lot about wanting a Classic Plus project, an idea that we develop vanilla WoW for new content. And well, back in the day, and especially after reliving Burning Crusade in Classic, I think a lot of people came to realise that we kind of did experience this in Burning Crusade, which is why it was so good, where gameplay still felt very much like vanilla did by the end of Naxxramas, except we had those few extra additions to take how classes worked and a few more class race combinations for Horde and Alliance, seeing Horde get Paladins and Alliance get Shamans, that felt like we were truly living in an extension of World of Warcraft and not a completely new game. I think the last time we probably felt this was in Wrath of the Lich King, that maybe took classes just slightly over the edge of what they were in vanilla, and then obviously Cataclysm was the first thing to revamp all classes entirely. Burning Crusade did a really great job treating the additions to classes like a nice little treat to essentially top off your class, that made classes feel somewhat just a bit better yet still grounded in the original game, essentially gave us that feeling of what Classic Plus should be. And whilst not perfect, there was still enough inconsistencies between each class to make sure that each class mattered in some way, all playing into part of the charm that Burning Crusade still maintained from our original experience in WoW. And to be honest, I think it helped for nostalgia purposes that BC ended on a high with Sunwell Plateau, as people were then excited to head into Wrath and keeping it favourable looking back during WoW's history. But there we have it, enough reminiscing for today. Take off your nostalgia glasses and get back to farming Mythic Plus. But in the wake of WoW's 20th anniversary, be sure to let me know what you loved about Burning Crusade and if you'd go back to it. Yet as always, take care out there, and I'll see you on the next one. Ta-ra for now.
As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.